Let's go ahead and get started, folks. Welcome again, another episode here, Tuesday morning of live training. Again, for Advanced Certification Prep Part 4. We are talking about reporting and publication today, a very exciting topic, I'm sure, for everybody. For those of you who don't know me, hello, my name is Christine Bonthias, and I'm a Senior Instructional Designer here at Alteryx. You can find me in most places in the Alteryx Academy section of the community with all things interactive lessons, live training, weekly challenges, that kind of stuff. So getting you ready for your advanced certification exam is very exciting for me. So like I said, we are on part 4 today. This is part of a 6-part series, so we are almost done. We've got a couple more coming up here by the end of April. If you've missed any of the first 3 sessions, they are now all published on the live training section of the community. So if you missed any of those, feel free to please go back and rewatch those and get caught up and prepared. So before we go ahead and dive into our content, just a couple of housekeeping items for you. We are scheduled here for about an hour or so today. I anticipate going about 45 minutes, maybe the full hour even, depending on our pace and if any questions come through. That being said, you have all been placed on mute as soon as you entered this call. And because we are recording this session, I would like to keep it that way. However, I do like to encourage all sorts of questions, or if you need clarification on anything during the session, please use the Q&A feature or the chat feature of the WebEx. I'm going to go ahead and try and keep an eye on that as much as I can throughout the presentation, so I can either address relevant questions as they come in, or if I see something that would be better addressed at a transition time, I'll wait till then, or even towards the end. But you're welcome to please go ahead and use that to ask any questions or ask for any clarification. I did mention we are recording this call, so after today's session, I will go ahead and render this video out and post it back to the live training post that you found on Community to access today's session. So give me a day or two to do that before I get that edited and rendered and then posted back up there. So that way, if you want to rewatch this or want to revisit anything we talk about today, or if any of your colleagues today couldn't make this call, they'll have an opportunity to absorb this content at a time that's convenient for them. So let's go ahead and get started here. Our agenda, we're first going to talk about some of the upcoming trainings that we've got going through the month of April. Can you believe it? We're already in April. It's amazing. We're going to spend some time talking about the background for today's training and some key concepts around reporting and how you might be asked questions around the reporting tool palette on the advanced exam. Really, that focus is going to be about how could you possibly be tested on the things that we're going to be talking about today. And then I have some helpful preparation resources for you that I found all through the community that I thought were particularly relevant and helpful for getting you ready for some of that, some of those questions for your advanced exam as well. So a brief announcement here, just because we've got to plug the Alteryx community. I'm assuming that most of you have already been there, especially since you found the link for this call. But if you haven't, I highly encourage you to sign in and geek out at Alteryx or community.alteryx.com. It's chock full of helpful resources for you in terms of discussion forums where you can post your own questions or even help other people answer their questions with your knowledge and your expertise that you have. It's a great way to network and connect with peers, especially through people all around the world who are using Alteryx Designer, or people who are right in your backyard. You know, sign up for an Alteryx user group, whether that's industry specific or one that's in your city or in a nearby area. It's a great way to discover new creative use cases and new inspiring ways people are using Designer to answer some pretty cool questions. It's also full of just insightful blogs, fun reading material, and if you haven't been to our developer community yet, over in DevSpace or the Alternation tab on the left-hand side of the navigation, it's a really awesome place where you can, no matter what your level, it's either a great way to engage in some really advanced kind of cutting-edge development, or even just see what people are even up to, even if it's not quite at your level yet. It's pretty inspiring stuff. In addition, we have a whole section of Alteryx Academy, all things training, all things learning made for you. We've got resources including interactive lessons, live trainings just like this one that you're attending today, weekly challenges. This week's is particularly entertaining, so I hope you check that out. And then, of course, product certification, which is in bold because that's why you're here. That's what you're interested in. Currently, we offer a couple different levels. We have the core level, which you need in order to even take the advanced exam. So if you have not yet passed your core exam, that would be a great place to start before moving on to your advanced certification exam. And once you've passed that advanced certification exam, you are eligible to try out the expert certification exam. And one quick plug there, if you haven't seen the weekly challenge, I think it wasn't the one we posted yesterday. It was one that came out last week, I believe. We actually released a question from the expert exam. It's a question that's been retired. So if you want to see a question that used to be on the exam and what it might take to pass that expert exam, I highly encourage you to give that weekly challenge a try. So let's talk a little bit about some upcoming live trainings here. Like I said, we're already here in April. Wow, Advanced Certification Prep Part 4, reporting. We've got an April full of trainings for you. Next week, we're going to be talking about Calgary databases, a really neat way to really make your workflow just fly. If you haven't used Calgary databases before or aren't really sure how to interact with that Calgary tool palette in Designer, that will be the session for you. On the 16th of April, here in a couple of weeks, we've got part 5 of our 6-part series for getting you ready for the advanced cert exam. And that one's going to be focused all around kind of advanced parsing and advanced data preparation. So you can expect a lot of things probably surrounding things like regular expressions and regex and parsing with regex and all those different kind of parsing output methods, as well as some pretty interesting parsing functionality from the formula tool, ones that aren't tested on the core exam that you certainly should expect to see on the advanced exam. So I hope you'll join us for that. On the 23rd, we have our final chapter at this point for the Born to Solve series, which is where someone, in the past it has been me, gets a problem put right in front of them at that very moment, and you get to watch that person go through the process of understanding the question, figuring out how to navigate the question, maybe take even a few wrong steps before they get to the answer. And it's kind of a nice opportunity to see that, no matter what your skill level with Designer, the problem-solving process is the same for all of us, right? Versus that kind of that first initial attempt at what am I trying to solve, and then you get a really kind of inside look as to that problem-solving process that person takes, and you might even pick up some cool tips and tricks that just watching someone do a workflow or do something differently from the way you do it, people come away with all sorts of fun little tidbits that they learn. And then finally, at the end of the month, April 30th, that is part 6 of the Advanced Cert Prep series. Woohoo! So that way you'll be ready to take that advanced certification exam anytime after that, sometime in May perhaps. In that last session, we're really going to be focusing on what you can expect on test day. What should you have in front of you as an open resource? What can you use? What would be most helpful? How to approach this test? Because it is different from your core certification exam that you may have taken already. There's a little bit different of a mindset you have to take with this, and there's a little bit different kind of like time management skills that you really need to prepare for, I think, in order to do well on the advanced exam as opposed to the core. And then in May, you'll see that we're still building out our calendar here, but we are going to pull back our trainings just a tad as we prepare for Inspire, which is coming up in June, which you're all very excited for. But we're probably only going to run about 2 sessions in May, so just keep an eye on the calendar here. We're probably going to run something on May 7th, and you can see our topic is still to be determined. We're not quite sure what that will be yet. And then currently we have it slated for May 21st for our second May session, but that might turn out to be May 28th. We still have to do a little bit of negotiating with the calendars there to see what works best for folks. But keep an eye on the calendar for those. We hope that you'll join us in May. And we certainly hope you'll join us at Inspire. That will be so exciting. All right, background for today's training is all about your mission, advanced certification. You can see we're working our way down this list of bullets here. We've already covered spatial analytics, we've done macros, we've done analytic apps, and today is another big one. It's reporting. Reporting and publication. And I will say, as I was preparing for this particular session and this particular one, I think this is the section of the test that most people probably struggle with the most. And I say that for a couple of different reasons. One is that unless you've spent a lot of time with the reporting tools, there's a lot of things you probably don't know. And there's probably a lot of things about them that even just a quick look at the help documentation or a quick look at a community article might not help you. This section, in my opinion, this section in particular really rewards mileage, hands-on application, practice in particular, with the reporting tool palette. So we're going to go really quick today through a lot of different tools in the reporting tool palette and how you can be tested on them. And I don't expect today's session to be probably nearly enough, to get you absolutely ready to really master that reporting section on the advanced exam. There's a possibility of seeing, probably between, 10 or 15 different questions, in that you could see all around reporting. It's a big tool palette, and there's a lot of little buttons that you can click, to make very different outcomes in a workflow that uses reporting tools. So like I said, I don't expect today's session to necessarily give you all the information you're going to need, but I hope it gives you a big overview or a nice overview of all the potential things that you possibly could see, and also probably signal some flags to you as to what don't I know and what do I need to go practice. So with that being said, we're going to talk about some key concepts here with just the reporting tool palette in general, what it looks like to configure a workflow with reporting tools, and we are going to go into depth with a certain with emphasis on a few examples, tools that you definitely will see. Expect them to be on the exam for sure. That's why I'm highlighting them. Particular emphasis on the layout tool, and I'll have a couple of kind of key tidbits as we go through as to what types of things lend themselves very well to probably a test question, through all these different tool configurations. And then rendering reports, right? Actually publishing and sharing and rendering out those reports. And I use that word render very specifically because, as we'll see, there is a tool that is used in the reporting tool palette to actually produce and output tools from the reporting tool palette, the render tool, as it were. And of course, the big focus today will how you can be tested on these items. And just like last week, because I got some good feedback on that, I decided that just like last week how we did with apps, or a couple weeks ago, I suppose, that we're going to open this up with a quiz. So that being said, maybe take a moment here to either grab your laptop, open it up, unlock it, maybe open Notepad so you can track your answers, or grab a piece of paper and a pencil or something like that so you can just write down your answers here, because we'll review these answers here at the end. So if you kind of want to give yourself maybe a little bit of a pre-test or pre-assessment, this is your opportunity to do so. So I'll go ahead and give folks about another few seconds or so before I go ahead and open up question 1. And just like last time, we've got 8 questions here, so we'll spend, maybe about 30 seconds or so on each question. I'll go ahead and read it out loud and give you about 20 to 30 seconds to actually answer the question. All right, are we ready? Let's do this. Quiz time. Question 1, true or false? To view a report snippet in Designer, a browse tool must be used. And this question does have a little bit of ambiguity to it, so we'll kind of clarify that as we go through today's training, but for the moment, put the answer that you think makes the most sense. All right, question 2. Which of the following tools is not in the reporting tool palette? Table, image, render, or text box? Which one is not in the reporting tool palette? All right, question 3. If it will move. It's a matching question. Match the tool from the left to its description of its anchors on the right. So match the tools listed by A, B, C, and D to its description on the right, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay, question 4. Which sequence of tools below would create a map with a legend in the top right corner? Question 5. In which tool can row and column rules be applied? The layout tool, the overlay tool, table tool, or the interactive chart tool? All right, question 6. Only a couple more to go here. Which tool or tools can use the output from the interactive chart tool? So this could be a potential select multiple question. Many answers can be correct here. Question 7. I like this question. The following data set is used to create a report table snippet that's grouped on city and state. The real question is, how many temporary HTML files will the render tool create? And last question, question 8. Another true or false? True or false? A workflow that produces a report cannot be published on the gallery. Okay. End of the quiz. We will review those answers here towards the end. So hold on to that, whether you open up a notepad file or whether you jotted that down on a piece of paper. Hold on to that. We will review that here towards the end. So I hope that kind of gave you a sense of some of those questions where maybe you flew through those were so easy, right? Then maybe today's session will really just be a refresher. But if really some of those just did not make any sense, and maybe it's because of my question writing abilities, but maybe you just did not even know like the insight was a tool, right? That has happened to people. This is the session for you. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of fly through this, kind of a high-level overview. Tools you are definitely expected to know. Which tools will probably give you the most bang for your buck in terms of studying up on. And then some foundational knowledge about those. And we're definitely going to take some time with a workflow today to really explore how these report tools are used to create some pretty cool outputs, right? All right, so reporting background here. Let's go ahead and just fly through some of these tools one by one because I have some kind of tidbits or insights for each of these. So the first one that you're going to be expected to know, and which one I would know in depth, is this. I have it called the charting tool here, and that was its old deprecated name, unfortunately. But the version that you're going to be tested on the advanced exam is what's known as the interactive chart tool. Okay, the interactive chart tool is a little bit different. Well, a little bit, quite a bit different actually, from the actual charting tool that depending on what version of the software that you are currently on, you may not actually see the interactive chart tool. I think the interactive chart tool came out, I want to say 2018-3, but maybe it was a little bit before then. I think it was 2018-3. So it's been around a little while now. But some of you, if you're on a version that's previous to that or older, you might not even see this tool. However, rules of the certification exam is that we always test on the most recent version of the software, which means that the chart tool, the old deprecated version, is not the version that you will be tested on. You will be tested on the interactive chart tool, okay? It is a little bit different. We'll dive into it more when I show you the workflow, but a couple of things I do want to make you aware of is that the layout of this chart tool or the interactive chart tool is very different from what you've seen with the charting tool in the past. However, it still has the same functionality in terms of being able to make area charts, bar and column charts, box and whisker charts, candlestick charts. I think that's actually new with the, in comparison to the older tool. We can do heat maps, and of course you've got your line and your scatter and your pie charts, right? So really all types of charts definitely possible here. What's a little bit different about this tool is using layers in order to create kind of multivariable charts. So if you have, like we have one today that builds out a couple of different things. We're plotting home median value and I think income against each other here. And we have to work with those different variables separately, right, in different layers. So every layer you get to pick a chart type to kind of map onto each other. But really the new interactive chart tool opens up a lot more flexibility, I think, in terms of styling and in terms of making it look good, right, and a lot of customization. You also still have the ability, just like in the old charting tool, you still have the ability to batch. You still have the ability to group your outputs based on a field or based on a value. We'll jump into that more when we actually go into the workflow. But the interactive charting tool is the one tool for charting that you will absolutely be tested on with the advanced exam. So I want to make that up front and clear with you right away. The next tool that I would highly recommend spending some time with, whoop, I just jumped backward, there we go, is the report map tool. The report map tool, admittedly, is probably one of the trickier tools to use. However, it's worth spending the time to learn to do because there are a lot of nice little configuration options here as well that make it a very testable kind of tool, as you saw in a couple of those different quiz questions that we presented at the beginning here. Obviously, the report map tool allows you to generate maps. It allows you to plot spatial objects in particular, one spatial object, two spatial objects, multiple spatial objects. But in order to use this tool, you must have that type of data. You must have a point, line, or polygon to be able to plot on a map, okay? The really important thing to know about also the report map tool is that this is, I think, the only, if I remember correctly, this is the only tool in the reporting tool palette that handles multiple data streams. It can actually accept, much like the union tool, for example, it can accept multiple inputs. And when I show you in the workflow how we use this report map tool, what's important to know is that every spatial object that you want to plot on this map, whether that's the point for your store location, and the polygon for your neighborhood or zip code boundary, and another polygon for the state boundary, all of those different spatial objects have to be linked up to this report map tool as its own incoming data stream, okay? So you can't actually import more than one spatial object per incoming data stream. I'll show you what that looks like in a workflow here in a bit, but I think that's something that's really important to latch onto, is that this tool in particular takes one input per one incoming data stream here. One tip that I love to recommend to people is that, maybe not so much for the certification in particular, but it's possible to do. It definitely makes your life easier when you're actually using this in the real world, is that you label your connection inputs for all those different data layers. Much like a union tool, when you start connecting, data stream 1, data stream 2, data stream 17, however many you're connecting to that union tool, it is really easy to lose track of what's what. And that is exactly the same case here with this report map tool. If you're linking up like 4 or 5 different spatial objects that you want to plot all on the same map, it is really hard to remember what data stream 1 and data stream 3 and data stream 5 are. Instead, label those incoming data streams to things like store point or zip code or, school location, whatever it might be. Because the report maps tool, as we dig into all these different tabs here, you can see on the right you've got the settings tab and the data tab and the layers tab and the legend. It takes the name from that incoming data stream. So if your incoming data streams are just named number 1, number 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it may be, it gets really tricky to customize those different layers appropriately, right? Whereas if you remember what they're named, it makes that so much easier. One really important thing to also know about the report map tool is that you do have the option for thematic mapping, and this can be applied for both categorical and numeric or continuous variables, right? So when I say categorical, I'm thinking of things like the one we're going to use today is distance ranges, or maybe a more appropriate one might be store number or by state, right? So you can apply kind of grouping for these categorical variables with thematic mapping in the report map tool. You can also use ramping or a different kind of method for the report map tool for things that are continuous variables, most likely that are something going to be numeric, right? So like sales revenue, or number of customers, or whatever it might be, right? But a numeric variable can be mapped. Categorical variables can be mapped as well. Something to know. You can create and customize your zooms in and out from a map extent. That is something that you absolutely can customize here. A really great test question on something that could be applied here would be something about zooming in and zooming out, right? Which ones are positive values and which ones are negative values? That's something you're going to find there on your settings tab for your zoom extent there in your map. And then also, how you can create inset maps using that bounding rectangle functionality that the report map has. We're going to cover more in detail when we go through the actual workflow, what's included on the data tab, the layers tab, and the legend tab, because as you did see, we have a couple questions as to how that map legend can be used or placed in context of the map that you create. The report text tool is definitely something to know as well. This allows you to add text to your reports, whether that's by manually entering text inside the tool, so that's something that you actually type in, or you use values or data from an incoming field, or even a combination of both. But one really important thing to know about this text input tool is that this one has an optional input anchor, because you can enter text in a couple of different ways, right? If you just want to manually enter text inside this tool, type in, "This is my beautiful report that I'm making," right? No upcoming data stream actually needs to be connected to this tool in order for you to type in, "This is the beautiful report I'm making." However, if you do actually want to update report text using a variable from upcoming data streams, then yes, you absolutely do want to connect an incoming data stream to this tool. But one thing to know is that this is one of the tools. There are a few in the reporting tool palette. There's this one, the report text tool. I think there's the image tool, and there might be one more. I'd have to visit. There are a couple there that have optional input anchors, and this is one of them. The report text tool can also be attached to other snippets. Report snippets is what we call them, when something that you make from the reporting tool palette. So these can be attached to maps, tables, charts, layouts, whatever you got. You can attach this text to that using some of these different configuration options, right? One of those radio buttons here. We'll explore that in a bit. Format, of course, it's all text, and you can put in all sorts of customizable things like images. Does support images, very cool. You can also customize your text font size, color, style. You can insert hyperlinks, position, all sorts of things that you can do to kind of make your report your own here. And of course, one thing that's also likely to come up potentially on even something like an advanced exam, definitely comes up in things like the expert exam, is using this functionality of using text as raw PCXML. So it's something to keep an eye out for, and there's a couple of different ways that I have outlined towards the end when I talk about weekly challenges that you can use to practice this, that really ask you to put that particular setting into practice. But it's good to know that it's there, right? It is a setting that is available to you in the report text tool. Table tool. Very exciting, and allows you to do just what you think it would, create data tables. But it does give you a couple different options to use. The basic table and also a pivot table. But one thing to know is that from the pivot table, you can only use this option. You can imagine I'm enunciating this because this lends itself to a very nice test question as well, is that you can only use this configuration, pivot table, if you're streaming in from a crosstab tool, right? So unless you have an upstream crosstab tool, that pivot table really isn't going to be an option for you. And to be honest, I would say most people are using that basic table mode anyway. Definitely a good mode to know, especially with how you can configure the size of your table, how to set those dimensions there in terms of, is it a fixed table width or a percentage table width, or how we're going to configure that. That's always a good thing to know. And then how you actually select your fields to display. You do have some kind of, I'll call it select tool functionality here in the table tool in terms of selecting by turning on a checkbox or turning off a checkbox in terms of the fields that you actually want to display in your tool or in your table. I'm sorry. Know the default table settings, including what's going to, and I guess more so to say, in addition to knowing the default settings, know what you can change. Know what you can actually customize, right? Including as soon as you turn on a table there, you can rename it. You can create and rename an outgoing column, right, in your table. You can customize its borders. You can also create row and column rules here with the table tool. This is something that most people, when they're looking at it, this is something that, like in Excel, you would probably use to do what's called conditional formatting, or conditional formatting. Like, how do I turn the text a different color, if it meets a certain condition or criteria, or how do I turn a row a different color, or how do I change the text or make it bold, in a certain column, whatever it might be. That conditional formatting is done here in the table tool specifically by using column and row rules. And let's just kind of explore a little bit what that looks like here. So let's say your column, which remember columns go vertically, is that you have a data set here with your annual sales, and you want to turn the sales that have 1.5 million or so greater than that, they should be in green. So you can see that column there, annual sales here, has that column rule applied where sales that are greater than 1.5 million are in green. And annual sales that are less than $1 million have been turned red. Okay, fantastic. Now let's also apply a row rule. Row rules go horizontally. So store rules, let's turn the Petland store, let's turn all that font blue and let's turn it bold. Fantastic. So one thing to note here is look at that Petland store. You can see that it has competing logic here, right? There's a column rule that's been applied and something that's actually been enabled by this criteria. You can see in the annual sales that its column has been turned green, right? That number in that column has been turned green. But of course, it's got that row rule also enabled, right? Turn the font blue and make it bold. One thing to know here is when you have competing logic like this, what's the outcome? What could it possibly be? Then something to know is that the column rule takes priority unless you have selected the option to override the conflict with the row rule. There is a configuration option there that enables you to do that. And this is one thing when I was talking about know what's enabled by default, right? Here's a default behavior of the table tool is that your column rule is going to take priority unless, here's your exception, unless you check that box to override the conflict. And this is what I mean when I say like the reporting tool palette really does reward mileage, because unless you go in and you practice and you put these things into a real workflow, there's a lot of buttons you can click and a lot of things that we can ask you about in terms of the reporting tool palette of what's possible here, of what can I do, or if I have this box clicked, what's my output going to be, or what can I expect as a result? Okay, and this table tool really does lend itself very nicely to those types of questions, especially with the conditional formatting. Leading into a layout tool, there might be a little bit of data manipulation that's required of you. And that might be either joining reporting tool snippets, sometimes it's unioning them, but most of the time it's going to be joining because reporting tools are treated as the different data streams, right? So let's say you have this chart tool that you need to put together with a map. So imagine a report that you're making that has to include both of these things, right? You want to make the richest report possible. It's got to have a chart. It's got to have a map to tell the whole story of your data here. But how do you get those two snippets together? How do you actually lay them out on the same report? Most of the time that's going to be done with a join tool, right? To actually join together each report snippet. So that way they're horizontal. They're side by side. You have one column that says chart reporting snippet and one column that says map reporting snippet. Typically, you could go a couple different ways here. You could either be joining by record position, like probably most people are doing joins, right? Or I'm sorry, by specific values. That's probably how you're mostly doing it, especially for grouping, if you have any kind of grouping enabled or batching going on in your workflow. Or more uncommonly, you could be also joining by record position because you want this report snippet that's in position 1 and this other report snippet that's also in position 1 to just be horizontal and next to each other, okay? Another way that you might see this is especially if you have more than one report snippet coming into play. Let's say you have a chart, let's say you have some text, and let's say you have a map, right? These reports are getting more and more complex. That join multiple tool is really going to come into play for you if you're joining more than those two snippets at a time. So typically these joins are going to be based on all these snippets that are aligned either vertically or horizontally, right? So you can see now we're doing a join multiple here because we need a map legend in a specific column. We need this report snippet for the map in a column. We need the report snippet for text, and we need the report snippet for a table, right? And just so you know, we need all these snippets in different columns because of the needs of the layout tool in particular, right? So this is kind of an interim step that is important to know, especially, and I point these two methods out with the joins and the join multiples, because imagine now that you're looking at a question, much like one that was posed to you in our practice quiz, in terms of the sequence of tools, right, that would create a map or create this workflow or create this report. You have to be able to identify that there could be multiple report snippets coming in and that they'd either need to be joined or join multipled, or, you know, don't be fooled sometimes by what the union will actually do. That does fool and trick people up quite a bit. So imagine like that's the kind of context in which you need to be able to understand and see these particular uses of the join and the join multiple tool. And that all leads into because of your layout tool, right? The layout tool needs to see all these different report snippets that you're creating as different columns or things that it wants to lay out together on a single report, right? So one quick thing about the layout tool here, because this does come up quite a bit. The layout tool that you will be tested on in the advanced exam is the layout tool that's currently in the reporting tool palette. Sometimes people get nervous that they're going to see the visual layout tool that's currently in the laboratory tool palette. Don't worry about it. You don't have to know that particular tool. You will only be tested on the layout tool that's currently in the reporting tool palette. And in 2018 2019 1 is which we're on right now, that still layout tool is still the one that we are working with, okay? Just want to make that clear. So the layout tool, right, has to see all these different reporting snippets that you're making to either organize them horizontally or vertically. And let's just go ahead and show you kind of what that looks like. Is understanding the layout tool here is tricky. I'm not going to lie to you. So take a look here on the left here. You've got this report output that you know you want to create. And on the bottom here, you've got all those different report snippets laid out in their different columns. You have your text on the bottom, you've got your chart, you have your map, you have your table. How on earth do you want to make this layout work? So let's first work with the options that are laid out horizontally, okay? The chart and the map are next to each other. They are horizontal to each other. So we are first going to use a layout tool here to lay a couple of different snippets out horizontally. We're going to lay out the chart and the map together horizontally. Now let's work on, so now we've got that one layout, right? So the layout tool makes that layout tool snippet. It's actually called layout, which sometimes can be difficult. But now you've got that whole snippet created. You've joined those two together to create one whole snippet, but you still have a couple more to work with. You have the report text at the top. You've got that now layout that has your map and chart together. But you also have your table and you have your report text at the bottom that all need to be vertical, right? So you're going to use yet another layout tool to, oh, my text didn't fit on one line there. You are going to go vertically now and choose those different report snippets that now need to be aligned vertically, okay? They all come together here with creating that final layout tool, okay? Of finally making that one layout with all those different snippets together. The render tool itself, and remember how I said at the end here that I use the word render very specifically for publishing and sharing your reports. And that is because outputting reports is done very specifically with that render tool. It transforms all your report snippets into reports in formats that you would expect that support those types of different reports, like PDFs, like HTML, Word documents, PowerPoints, Excel, all those different things. And you can output either temporary files of that type, or you can output very specific files of that type, where you actually get to go in and choose the file name that you select for it, and it will always output to this directory, or it will always output as this file name. Or if you just want something to be able to have, like someone's running something on the run, like on the gallery, for example, you might just want to output there to a temporary kind of HTML or render that in a certain way. One important thing to note is that the render tool, like the output data tool, does support grouping. It supports batch outputs. However, Your batch outputs can only be used if you're outputting to a specific file type. Any kind of temporary file will only write out one big, massive report. You cannot use grouping if you're outputting to a temporary file. Kind of an interesting fact. The render tool, and I allude to the render tool kind of like the output data tool because it's kind of the equivalent, but for reporting snippets, right? So things like any kind of reporting snippet that you make, like the interactive chart tool, for example, or report text or a table, right? You can't output that with the output data tool. But all these reporting snippets have to go out through the render tool. So it has some of that functionality like the output data tool does, like creating those output files, like grouping or batching those different outputs. But it's also nice because it has some different functionality that you can use snippets to put headers and footers, for example, as part of your report. Or you have the option to customize your paper size or your file size, or not your file size, I'm sorry, but your orientation, whether that's portrait or landscape, to make it work best for you in your final output presentation, right? So it's got a little bit different functionality from just the output data tool, and it outputs to different file types. Like, for example, you can't go to a YXDB file or something like that from a render tool, but you can go out to other file types that your traditional output data tool does not support. So real quick, I just want to go ahead and show you a workflow here, and I will post this to the live training post so that way you can have this as your example. But I want you to see a workflow that has reporting tools in action, right? And I want you to see this in the context of a couple different things that we've already spoken about today. So I'll go ahead and run this real fast so that way we have it fresh. And while that happens, I'll just kind of give you a walkthrough of what's going on. Pretty simple workflow, really. You got a couple inputs here. One at the top is being summarized and grouped by store number and distance, and doing some calculations of median income and home value, counting customers, and then calculating the average distance of that customer to a nearest store. We're doing some sorting, things like that. You've got another data stream here of some of that spatial data, so creating points, latitudes, and longitudes of these different store locations. So let's go ahead and start with this top stream here, so that way we can move on to this nice layout section. The first one I want to point out to you here is that interactive chart tool, right? So when you have an interactive chart tool, you'll see that the configuration is a little bit different. It launches you into this nice kind of configuration area. But one thing you'll notice here when you are building a report or a workflow that has a lot of reporting tools in it, you'll probably use a lot more browse tools than you're normally used to. And one reason for that is because you can't really see a reporting snippet, right? You can't actually see this unless you have a browse tool. So if I'm just clicking here on this output anchor of this map, for example, right, I'm only seeing the tool configuration here. I don't actually see any data. There's nothing for me to actually view besides the report snippet, which just looks kind of like a mess at the moment. To actually see what you're making with reporting tools, you will probably be using a lot of browses, right? Because as soon as you click on a browse, you can actually see, oh, cool, my map is looking the way I hoped it would, stuff like that. So that's one big thing to keep in mind. And when you actually are putting this workflow maybe like in production, you'll probably get rid of a lot of those browse tools if you no longer need them. But when you're building, you definitely need those browse tools to see those reporting snippets that you're creating. So on that note, let's go ahead and jump into this interactive chart tool here. One big thing to know with the interactive chart tool is that you do work with layers here, and this will take a little while to fire up. You can see that every time you want to add a different layer to create some more complex charts, for example, so right now we're plotting median home value against median income for those different distance ranges that you are from a store. So if you're 0 to 3 miles from a store, or 3 to 6 miles from a store, 6 to 9, or 9 to 12 miles, here is your actual median income, and then here's the associated median home value. So we've got a couple different charts going on here. We've got a scatter plot, and we've got a bar chart here. And the way that you add those different layers to your actual chart is by going in and adding these layers, and then going in and then plotting your X and your Y. So you choose a column here to be what is my X and what is my Y, and how do I want to orient that. And the more complex your charts get, the more layers you're going to be adding here. So one really important thing to know about this particular tool is that yes, you do have all these different layers. You can save templates, which is really cool. You also still have the ability to do grouping, right? Grouping in the interactive chart tool is referred to as batching. And if you want to enable that, you do have to turn that on. It is a button that you have to click. And then you get to decide how you want to group your data. So in this case, we are grouping by store number so that all of the different stores that we have in our data set will get a separate chart created for it, okay? So that's one cool thing about the interactive chart tool in particular. Let's go ahead and check out our table real quick. I do just want to refresh you here that you've got your basic table mode and your pivot table mode, that you also have grouping enabled, and the grouping is turned on by just selecting a simple checkbox here. Okay, so this will actually create a different table for every value in store number. So for all of my different 10 stores or however many I have, all of those different 10 stores are going to get a separate report here, right? Remember that you have a couple of different ways to configure your table with its dimensions. So it can be automatic, kind of does the decision for you. It's a percentage, or you do have fixed options in case those dimensions really need to be controlled. Like we said before, remember that you can, you have a little bit of a select tool functionality here in terms of I can turn on or off a column depending on which one I want. I can rename this field if I want. I can kind of customize it a little bit more. I can also rearrange these, so I can actually, using these these arrows up here, I can actually push different columns up or down, kind of like reordering in the select tool. And don't forget here, of course, you have your column rules that you have to apply. So every time you click a different column here, you've got to create a rule specific to that column. But then row rules are a little bit different. They're set down here, and then they go across the data, right? Okay, so remember, when you have a conflict here of column rule and row rule, which one does take precedence? Because we have these two different report snippets here that we actually want to lay out together, right, we are going to join these together. And when you are using grouping, you may find that by joining the data together on a specific field, that you're going to get the best results, right? Because otherwise, joining by record position, if you're just trying to put report snippets next to each other, fantastic. But otherwise, joining by specific fields is really, when you're using grouping, what you want to be able to do here. I'm going to go ahead and jump down here to this mapping section because I do want to get to that quiz review section quickly. And like I said, I'll post this workflow for you so that way you can see the rest of this workflow. I'm not going to go through the layout at this particular point because I do want to get to that quiz review. But one thing that's really important to know about the mapping tool, right, is that it does have that very specific anchor to accept those multiple different inputs. And you can see I didn't do it here like against my recommendation, but I have two different spatial objects coming in, right? I've got one spatial object for a point, or one point here, which is labeled by my store location, and then I have another different spatial object that's coming in for my customer locations. And in this map here, you do have to add those incoming connections. And you can imagine, I don't know at this point what is number 1 and what is number 2 unless I look back at the workflow. Had I labeled them, these would be reflecting the name of that incoming data stream, which makes things easier. For every incoming data stream, you do have to select the spatial field from that one that you want to map, which is why you have to usually connect multiple spatial objects to a map tool, because it only supports one spatial object from an incoming data stream at a time. So pick your spatial field. So if you have multiple here, then you're going to have to split them out, probably with a select tool. You do have the option for grouping. You can see we've enabled grouping for the store number here. But then the thematic field is also something that's really important. This is how you're going to be able to control some of those looks and feels for some of those things that maybe have meaning in terms of chloroplast mapping or categorical mapping, or things that color is going to be very helpful for you for. So anything here that you've selected as a thematic field, like in here for your customers, we selected the distance range. So whether you're 0 to 3 miles from a store, 3 to 6, 6 to 9, or 9 to 12, however far you are, you get a different color here on the map. So even though those might seem like numeric variables, 0 to 3, 3 to 6, they're actually categorical because you're being grouped into a bucket, right? So for those different themes, you will get different ways to tile those different values and different ways you can represent those colors, either with a color ramp like we've selected here. You're kind of going from red to blue. Maybe you'll see red to green sometimes for more numeric values. And you get to customize and pick those colors as well. One important thing to know about a map legend in particular is that your map legend can actually be output as a separate field that can be used by the overlay tool to kind of customize if you want your legend on the top right or the top left or the bottom right or the bottom left. Otherwise, you've got options to just put it on the left or on the right, kind of in the center of that map that you create. Outputting as a separate field allows you to really kind of customize the look and feel with the overlay tool. The overlay tool asks you to pick a base. In this case, it is our map, and then pick an overlay field from that. So maybe it's text that you have coming in, or maybe it's this legend, for example. And depending on where I want that to show up, you can see I've got that here in the top right corner. This is how I control that. By having my legend output as a separate field or a separate column, the overlay tool allows me to customize its placement. So you can see that right here. That renders. Over here to the top right. Not saying it's the best looking one, but I'm saying it's an option. All right, so because we are running short on time, I do want to go ahead and cover those quiz questions here. I will post this workflow so you can investigate how we went through all the different layouts here, again with another join based on specific fields, and then how we assembled the layouts both horizontally and vertically with some text in order to create a batched final output. So just because I want to show that it is batched, one thing I will say here is that here in your results window is where you'll be able to see how many different files were actually created from this results window or from this workflow. So every time that that render tool creates a new file, you will get a note in your messages log about that. All right, so let's go ahead and review these questions, and I'm looking at them and I'm hoping that the actual answers were highlighted there. They are. Perfect. So for question 1, if you want to go ahead and pull up your answers, we'll review. So true or false, and this is when I said I had a little bit of ambiguity here, right, is to view a report snippet in Designer, a browse tool must be used. So some of you may have answered false because technically in that results window, right, you can see that there is a snippet right there. But remember how I said you can't actually see it. You don't know what you actually made. You have to use a browse tool in order to see that report snippet here in that like configuration window area. So that's something important to know. Question 2, which of the following tools is not in the reporting tool palette? And that would be the text box tool. There is a report text tool in the reporting tool palette, but the text box tool is actually in the interface tool palette. Question 3 was matching. So matching the tool from the left to the proper description of its anchors on the right. So the render tool itself has, because it's like an output data tool, has one input anchor. It only can accept one input, but no output anchor. So the output from the render tool can't be used by another tool in Designer. Okay. The report text tool, as we pointed out, has an optional input anchor because you can manually enter text into that tool's configuration. The report map tool is the tool that can accept multiple inputs, has that very special anchor that allows it to accept multiple spatial objects. And then finally, the layout tool, like most tools, has one input anchor and one output anchor. Question 4 asks you to visualize a sequence of tools that would create a map with the legend in the top right corner. And the proper sequence of these options is D, input data, a report map. Also assume in that report map now that you've output your legend as a separate field, so that way you can use the overlay tool and then a browse tool to see it, right? So option D here is your correct answer. Question 5, which tool can you use row and column rules? And that would be your table tool, right? Your table tool really is only some of your options here that has rows and columns anyway. But your table tool is where you can apply that conditional formatting. Little tricky. Which tool or tools can use the output from the interactive chart tool? And the answer is A, B, and C. You can use the interactive chart tool to be fed into an insights tool, which some of you may or may not be super familiar with, but it can be used for the insights tool. You can also use it in the layout tool, as we saw, and you can also render a table. But the tool that cannot use it is the output data tool. You're not going to output much meaningful information from that. Oh, this question. I love this question because it's tricky. It tricked me even the other day when I was making it. The following data set is used to create a report table snippet that's grouped on city and state. Okay, so here's your table. It's grouped on city and state. So you can imagine now in that table tool, with selecting that grouping mechanism, you can expect to output 3 different tables, right? Because it's grouped on city and state, so you have 3 different unique combinations of those values. You have Colorado, Denver, Colorado, Grand Junction, and Texas, Dallas. The real question, though, is how many temporary HTML files will the render tool actually create? When you use temporary output files from the render tool, you cannot enable grouping, which means you can't actually output those 3 separate tables. You will only get one output file from your render tool. Tricky, tricky, tricky. And finally, question 8. True or false? Should be pretty easy. A workflow that produces a report cannot be published on the gallery, and that, of course, is false. You can absolutely output reports on the gallery. One interesting variation on this question that you possibly could see is a workflow that produces an insight cannot be published on the gallery, and that, too, would also be false. You can absolutely use insights on the gallery. That's where they're very powerful, in fact. It's what they were made for. So that would also be something to look into for your insights tool in case that's something that's a little more unfamiliar for you. Some preparation resources, because I know we are definitely over time, but I want to give you some helpful resources that I found particularly useful for this section of the exam. We have a couple live trainings specifically on reporting. So if you found today's session kind of a whirlwind, which I know it was, but also you just really need to go back and visit the basics, I highly encourage you to go back to our live trainings on Introduction to Reporting. If you're a little bit more advanced, of course, reviewing the reporting for intermediate users. And then we have a whole section specifically dedicated to grouping in particular. So grouping on tables, grouping in maps, grouping in that render tool, all about batch reporting. Practice, practice, practice. I cannot emphasize that enough. With your weekly challenges here, I've pointed out a few that really do use the reporting tools quite a bit, mostly in the context of also building apps, so it's kind of a double whammy of a practice. But the most recent one we published, the one yesterday, Challenge 158, asks you to use some of those reporting tools, so I encourage you to look at that. Challenge 153, 95, 91, all use the reporting tools in some different types of ways that I think are very good practice. And if you're ready to level up, of course, we have tool mastery articles on all these tools. We have knowledge base articles, chock full of knowledge, and then there are a couple of very helpful EngineWorks blogs in particular. And if you use the keyword kind of visualytics, those will kind of narrow down the ones that I think are most relevant for just review. And that is all we have for it today. I know that was an absolute whirlwind, but I am more than happy to stay on the line for those of you who are also willing to stay on the line and either ask questions or ask for some additional clarification on anything that we've talked about today. We've got a couple more minutes or so. But if not, I totally understand. It's time to get on with your Tuesday, and I appreciate you attending. Don't forget that this will also be posted to the website here in a day or two. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we will see you next time. Thank you, everyone.